On the afternoon of September 14, 1978, an event transpired within a McDonald's establishment in Alexandria, Virginia, which brought to light a significant Soviet intelligence operation functioning covertly in the vicinity of the nation's capital. This eatery was situated just off U.S. Route 1, a bustling commuter artery connecting Washington, D.C. with the expansive suburban areas of Northern Virginia. It served a steady influx of government employees, military personnel, and contractors who frequented the area daily. The locale was nestled between a gas station and a strip mall, but the activities unfolding there, in plain sight, were anything but commonplace. These activities were not uncovered through sophisticated surveillance or federal agents, but rather by an employee who noticed something out of the ordinary. The employee was Patricia Martinez, a 23-year-old woman who had been employed at McDonald's for slightly more than a year. Her duties included taking customer orders, operating the cash register, and periodically cleaning the dining area, which involved wiping tables, sweeping floors, and emptying waste bins. It was during one of these cleaning rounds, around 2:30 in the afternoon, that something captured her attention. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark suit and wearing glasses, had been occupying a booth near the rear of the dining area for approximately 20 minutes. He appeared to be unaccompanied, eating at a leisurely pace and occasionally checking his watch, presenting as the kind of patron seemingly in no particular haste to depart. Then a second man entered. He was younger, perhaps in his late 30s, with dark hair and a more substantial physique, and if one was apprehended or came under suspicion, the other could simply disengage and disappear without ever having been directly associated with the compromised individual. But this dead drop had been compromised. The bag had been intercepted, and now there was an opportunity to dismantle the operation and identify both the asset who was stealing the information and the handler who was receiving it. The plan devised by Kellerman and his team involved conducting surveillance at the McDonald's during the hours when the exchanges had previously occurred, which, based on Patricia's observations, appeared to be Thursday afternoons between approximately 2 and 3 o'clock. It was estimated that another meeting would take place within the next 2 to 3 weeks, assuming the network had not been alarmed by the older man's unsuccessful attempt to retrieve the bag on November 9th. FBI agents would be positioned inside the restaurant, posing as customers, and additional agents would be stationed in vehicles outside, prepared to initiate mobile surveillance on both men the moment they departed the premises. The objective was to observe the exchange, follow both individuals to determine their post-McDonald's destinations, and gather sufficient evidence to support arrests and charges that would withstand scrutiny in federal court. The surveillance operation commenced on November 16, 1978, with agents rotating shifts to prevent any single face from becoming too familiar to regular patrons or staff. For the initial week, nothing transpired. The McDonald's experienced its usual influx of customers, commuters stopping for lunch, families with children, and teenagers gathering after school. But neither of the two men Patricia had described appeared. The second week unfolded similarly. By the start of the third, frustration had begun to emerge among the task force. Some believed the operation had been compromised, that the older man's confrontation with Patricia had generated enough suspicion within the Soviet network to shut down the site. Kellerman, however, believed there was still a chance the network would attempt to re-establish contact, that the loss of one exchange would not be enough to abandon a method that had been successful for so long. On December 7, 1978, Kellerman's intuition was partially confirmed. The younger man entered the McDonald's just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the event was immediately relayed to the FBI surveillance team via radio. But something was different this time, an alteration that became evident within the first few minutes of observation. The younger man appeared anxious. He scanned the dining area more frequently than Patricia had described in her previous accounts, his movements quick and tense, his eyes sweeping across the booths and tables as if he were seeking someone who was not present. He placed his order at the counter, his voice audible to the undercover agent standing 2 people behind him in line, and he occupied a booth toward the back of the restaurant. He began eating, but his attention was clearly divided. His gaze repeatedly returned to the entrance, watching each person who walked through the door. The older man never arrived. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. There was no sign of him. The younger man finished his meal, left his trash on the table rather than depositing it in the bin near the exit, and exited the restaurant. FBI agents waiting in unmarked vehicles outside immediately initiated mobile surveillance. Tracking the younger man as he walked to a parking lot 3 blocks away, entered a late-model sedan, and drove toward the outskirts of Alexandria. The pursuit persisted for another 20 minutes, with agents maintaining a careful distance to avoid detection, before the younger man eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small apartment complex in a residential neighborhood off Seminary Road. Agents recorded the address, the vehicle's license plate number, and the apartment building number the man entered. They then terminated the surveillance, unwilling to risk revealing their presence by following him inside or lingering too long in an area where an unfamiliar vehicle would stand out. Over the next 2 weeks, surveillance continued both at the McDonald's and at the apartment complex where the younger man had gone. Background checks were conducted on the vehicle registration, which revealed it belonged to a David Allen Becker, a 38-year-old technical analyst employed by a defense contractor named Systems Analysis Corporation, which held classified contracts with the Department of Defense. Further investigation disclosed that Becker possessed security clearance that granted him access to sensitive materials related to satellite reconnaissance systems, communications protocols, and technical specifications for hardware utilized in intelligence-gathering operations. He had been in that position for nearly 4 years since early 1975, and his personnel file showed no red flags, no reported financial problems, no disciplinary issues, and no failed polygraph examinations. On paper, David Becker was precisely the kind of dependable, mid-level contractor that defense agencies relied on to ensure the smooth operation of classified programs. But the evidence was beginning to suggest otherwise. The younger man appeared at the McDonald's one more time on December 21st, and once again he arrived alone, looked around nervously for several minutes, and then departed without making contact with anyone. The older man, the individual Patricia had seen retrieve the bag on 3 separate occasions, never returned. It was becoming evident that something had fundamentally disrupted the operation, and Kellerman decided to proceed with an arrest before the trail went completely cold, or before Becker realized he was under investigation and attempted to flee or destroy evidence. On the morning of December 23, 1978, FBI agents executed a federal arrest warrant and a search warrant on David Becker's apartment at dawn. Becker was taken into custody as he left his apartment to go to work, and agents immediately began a systematic search of the premises. What they discovered confirmed the suspicions of the investigation. Inside a closet in the bedroom, concealed beneath a stack of blankets, was a 35mm camera and several rolls of undeveloped film. In a desk drawer, agents discovered handwritten notes containing technical specifications and data that matched materials Becker would have accessed through his employment at Systems Analysis Corporation. In the kitchen, an envelope holding nearly $8,000 in cash, divided into bundles of $100 bills, was found taped inside a cabinet above the refrigerator. Becker was transported to the FBI field office in Alexandria and placed in an interrogation room. For the initial 3 hours, he remained silent, asserting his right to remain silent and requesting legal counsel. However, as morning transitioned to afternoon and the evidence was systematically presented to him, Becker's resolve began to falter. After consulting with a public defender and being informed of the potential sentences he faced under espionage statutes, Becker agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration during sentencing. What Becker communicated to the FBI over the subsequent days both confirmed the investigation's findings and became a profound source of frustration for Kellerman and his team. Becker confessed that he had been photographing classified materials for approximately 2.5 years, commencing in the spring of 1976, using the camera located in his apartment to duplicate documents he accessed through his work. He elaborated that he had been recruited by a man he knew only as Victor, an individual who had approached him at a bar in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Sometime in late March or early April of 1976, the approach had been gradual, professional, and meticulously planned. Victor had initiated a conversation, purchased Becker a drink, and over several weeks cultivated what appeared to be a genuine friendship. They had met for drinks multiple times, always at different venues, always in public spaces where their discussions would be obscured by ambient noise and where surveillance would be challenging to establish. Eventually, Victor made his proposition. He informed Becca that he worked for an organization interested in obtaining specific types of technical information. Information that the United States government had classified, but which, in Victor's view, should not be classified because it represented scientific knowledge belonging to the world, not to any single nation. Victor initially framed the request in ideological terms, appealing to Becca's sense of fairness and his dissatisfaction with government bureaucracy. Yet, when this approach did not achieve immediate success, Victor shifted to a more pragmatic argument. He inquired about Becca's financial situation, and Becca, who was at that time struggling with debt and medical bills from his wife's recent surgery, admitted to financial difficulties. Victor offered a solution. Provide copies of certain documents, nothing that would endanger lives or compromise military operations, merely technical specifications and data that would help equalize the playing field among nations. In return, Victor would pay him amounts that began at $500 per exchange and subsequently increased to several thousand. Becca asserted that his motivation had been primarily financial, that he had been desperate, and that Victor had exploited that desperation. However, the FBI's assessment was that Becca had been fully aware of his actions and had made a deliberate choice to betray his country for monetary gain. The dead drop at the McDonald's had been Victor's design, implemented sometime in the late summer or early fall of 1976 after initial exchanges had occurred through other methods that Becca could not fully recall or claimed not to remember in detail. The system was straightforward and, as Victor had assured him, virtually infallible. Becca would photograph the documents when possible, develop the film using chemicals and equipment supplied by Victor, and then place the photographs inside his McDonald's bag during lunch. The entire transaction took less than a minute and required no verbal communication, no eye contact, and no direct interaction that could be observed or recorded by any watchful party. The system had operated without incident for just over 2 years through dozens of exchanges, until the afternoon of November 9, 1978, when Patricia Martinez had intercepted the bag before Victor could retrieve it. Becca explained that he had waited in the parking lot that day, as he always did after making a drop, to see if Victor successfully collected the bag. When Victor exited the McDonald's empty-handed, Becca realized something had gone awry. He followed the communication protocol Victor had established for emergencies, placing a specific mark on a utility pole and waited for Victor's response. However, Victor never responded. When pressed for specific details about Victor, Becca's information proved exasperatingly vague and, in certain instances, intentionally misleading. He described a man in his mid-40s, approximately 6 feet tall, with brown hair beginning to gray at the temples, and a slight accent that Becca believed was Eastern European, possibly Russian, Polish, or Czech. Beyond this physical description, Becca claimed to know almost nothing useful. No last name, no address, no phone number, no information about where Victor lived or worked, or what cover identity he utilized in his daily life. All communications between Becca and Victor had been managed through a signaling system that required no direct contact. When Becca had materials to transfer, he would place a piece of red tape on a specific mailbox along Route 1, about 2 miles south of the McDonald's on any given Tuesday. Victor would then respond by leaving a chalk mark on a utility pole near the restaurant on a Wednesday, confirming that the exchange would take place the following afternoon. The FBI cross-referenced Becca's physical description of Victor with their database of known and suspected Soviet intelligence operatives working in the United States. They generated a list of approximately 40 potential matches, but none could be definitively linked to the man Becca had described with sufficient certainty to warrant arrests or further investigation. Kellerman's assessment was that Victor was likely operating under deep cover, using an alias and a meticulously constructed legend designed to withstand casual scrutiny and leave no paper trail. The only realistic method to identify Victor, Kellerman concluded, was to set a trap using Becca as bait and hope that Victor's operational discipline would falter. On January 9, 1979, with Becca's full cooperation and under FBI supervision, a piece of red tape was placed on the designated mailbox along Route 1, signaling to Victor that Becca had materials ready for transfer. The FBI had prepared a set of false documents, convincing forgeries resembling legitimate classified materials related to satellite reconnaissance, but containing information that was either obsolete or deliberately misleading and useless for intelligence purposes. The plan was for Becca to follow the usual routine exactly as he had done dozens of times before. Arrive at the McDonald's on the designated Thursday afternoon, order food, eat his meal, place the bag on top of the trash bin near the exit, and depart. FBI agents would be positioned throughout the restaurant and in vehicles outside, prepared to act the moment Victor retrieved the bag. Kellerman and his team arrived at the location early on Thursday morning and began setting up their positions. 2 agents posed as customers inside the dining area, one positioned near the front windows with a clear view of the entrance, and the other near the back booths where Victor typically sat. 3 additional agents were stationed in unmarked vehicles in the parking lot. A surveillance van equipped with radio equipment was positioned across the street with a view of both the restaurant entrance and the Route 1 access points. Patricia Martinez and Lisa Harmon were both working that day, and they had been briefed by FBI agents to act as naturally as possible and to avoid doing anything that might alert Victor or any counter-surveillance operatives to the presence of law enforcement. David Becker arrived at the McDonald's just after 2:00 in the afternoon, precisely as planned. He ordered his food and sat down in a booth near the center of the dining area. FBI agents observed as he finished his meal, gathered his trash into the brown paper bag, stood up, and walked to the trash bin near the exit. He placed the bag on top of the bin, exactly as he had done in previous exchanges, and exited the restaurant. The bag remained there, visible and untouched, for 1 minute, then 2, then 5. Kellerman, monitoring the operation from the surveillance van across the street, felt his pulse quicken as the minutes continued to pass without any sign of Victor. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The bag remained on top of the trash bin, and no one approached it. Customers came and went, some glancing at the bag as they disposed of their own trash. Yet, no one picked it up. At 20 minutes, Kellerman began to accept what was becoming increasingly apparent. Victor was not coming. The decision was made to have one of the undercover agents inside the restaurant retrieve the bag, and the operation was officially called off. Surveillance continued at the McDonald's for the next 3 weeks, with agents maintaining a presence during the hours when previous exchanges had occurred. But Victor never appeared. Agents also monitored the mailbox and the utility pole for any indication that Victor had attempted to re-establish contact with Becca through the signaling system. But there was nothing. No chalk marks, no suggestion that Victor was still in the area or still active. The FBI's inquiry into Victor persevered for several more years, involving regular examinations of the case file and endeavors to align Becca's portrayal with recently identified Soviet intelligence personnel. Yet no substantial breakthroughs ever surfaced. Becca underwent numerous interviews over the years, including during debriefings conducted by CIA counterintelligence specialists, who hoped he might recall additional specifics regarding Victor's appearance, manner of speaking, or conduct that could be cross-referenced with other active investigations. He placed an order at the counter, carried his meal to a booth on the opposite side of the dining area, and began to eat. The 2 men never acknowledged each other. There was no eye contact, no gestures, no conversation. To any casual observer, they would have simply appeared as 2 strangers coincidentally having lunch in the same restaurant at the same time. However, what transpired next indicated something different. The younger man finished his meal, gathered the remnants of his food into the brown paper McDonald's bag it had come in, and stood up. He proceeded towards the exit, and as he passed the trash bin near the door, he meticulously placed the bag on top of the receptacle, not inside it, but on the flat surface above, and exited without glancing back. A few moments later, the older man rose from his booth, walked directly to the trash bin, picked up the bag, and departed the restaurant. Patricia had been in the process of wiping a table when this exchange occurred, and she paused, rag in hand, attempting to comprehend what she had just witnessed. It was certainly peculiar, but was it anything more significant? Perhaps the younger man had forgotten something in the bag, and the older man was a friend retrieving it for him. Perhaps they had arrived together, and she simply hadn't noticed. However, Becca consistently maintained that he had divulged all he knew to investigators, and that Victor had taken care to disclose as little as possible about his genuine identity or background. David Allen Becker faced multiple charges of espionage under Title 18 of the United States Code. And in March of 1979, following weeks of negotiations between his legal counsel and federal prosecutors, he entered a guilty plea for the unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign power. On April 12, 1979, Becker appeared before a federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia for sentencing. During the proceedings, Becker's attorney advocated for leniency, asserting that Becker had been manipulated and pressured by an elaborate foreign intelligence operative, that he had cooperated fully with investigators subsequent to his apprehension, and that he had expressed sincere regret for his deeds. Federal prosecutors countered that Becker's primary motivation was avarice, that he had received thousands of dollars over more than 2 years for betraying his nation, and that his cooperation ultimately failed to yield any actionable intelligence concerning Victor or the broader Soviet network operating in the Washington area. The judge, after evaluating the evidence and hearing arguments from both parties, sentenced David Becker to 18 years in federal prison, remarking that his actions had jeopardized American national security and that the lenient sentence he might have received for cooperation was undermined by the fact that his cooperation had not resulted in any further arrests. Becker would ultimately serve 11.5 years before being granted parole in November of 1990. The McDonald's in Alexandria remained operational for approximately 20 years after 1978. But the operation itself, the dead drop that had performed seamlessly, was concluded. And it ended not due to sophisticated counterintelligence efforts or groundbreaking surveillance technology, but because an observant employee noticed that a man repeatedly left his trash on top of the bin and deemed it worthy of closer inspection. She resumed her tasks, and by the end of her shift, the incident had receded into the day's background noise. But 3 weeks later, it recurred. On October 5, 1978, the same 2 men appeared at the McDonald's, and the sequence of events unfolded in precisely the same manner. The older man arrived first, sometime around 2 hours in the afternoon, and took a seat in one of the booths along the far wall. He ordered food, ate slowly, and waited. Approximately 20 minutes later, the younger man entered, ordered at the counter, sat down in a separate booth, and finished his meal. As he left, he placed his brown paper bag on top of the trash bin near the exit. Seconds later, the older man stood up, retrieved the bag, and walked out. This time, Patricia was convinced it was not a mere coincidence. The timing was too exact, the movements too deliberate. The 2 men were executing a routine, and whatever their purpose, they were going to considerable lengths to avoid being seen together. She mentioned it to her brother that evening, a man named Michael Martinez, who worked as a security guard at a federal office building in Arlington, believing that if anyone would take the observation seriously, it would be someone with a security background. However, Michael's reaction was dismissive, even derisive. The suggestion was made, half-jokingly, that perhaps Patricia had uncovered spies operating from a McDonald's, a notion so seemingly absurd that the conversation moved on, and the matter remained unresolved. Still, Patricia could not shake the feeling that what she had witnessed was intentional, that it signified something beyond the innocent explanations her brother had offered. She resolved that if it happened again, she would observe more closely and, if necessary, determine her next course of action. The decision to treat the observation seriously, to regard it as something deserving investigation rather than dismissing it as coincidence or paranoia, would ultimately be the thread that unraveled an intelligence operation that had been successfully active in Northern Virginia since at least the spring of 1976, and potentially for a longer duration. On October 26th, the opportunity for closer observation presented itself. The older man arrived first, as on previous occasions, settling into a booth near the rear of the dining area. This time, Patricia had enlisted the assistance of a co-worker, Lisa Harmon, who had been employed at the McDonald's for about 6 months, and whom Patricia trusted sufficiently to involve in what still seemed like a situation that might prove to be insignificant. The 2 women positioned themselves where they had a clear view of both the older man and the entrance, and they waited. 20 minutes later, the younger man entered. He ordered food and carried it to a booth on the opposite side of the restaurant, where he began eating. Patricia and Lisa watched without making their attention conspicuous, carrying out their usual duties while keeping both men within their peripheral vision. When the younger man concluded his meal, he wiped his hands on a napkin and began gathering the remnants of his food into the brown paper bag. But then, just before folding the top of the bag closed, he reached into his jacket pocket, extracted something small, too small and too quick for Patricia or Lisa to clearly identify from their vantage point, and placed it inside the bag. He folded the bag, stood up, walked to the trash bin near the exit, and placed it on top. Then he departed. A few seconds later, the older man stood up, walked to the trash bin, picked up the bag, and exited the restaurant. Patricia and Lisa exchanged glances, and the unspoken question between them was evident. What was in that bag? The fact that the younger man had added something to it before leaving, something he had brought with him and kept in his jacket pocket, elevated the situation from merely peculiar to genuinely suspicious. Over the subsequent 2 weeks, the two women discussed what they had observed and formulated a plan. The next time the exchange occurred, Patricia would position herself near the trash bin, feigning to clean or restock supplies. The moment the younger man placed the bag on top and left, she would seize it and dispose of it before the older man could retrieve it. Then, in the back of the restaurant, away from customers and any potential witnesses, they would open the bag and discover its contents. It was a risky endeavor, and there was a possibility the older man would confront her or create a scene. However, Patricia reasoned that if he did, she could simply feign ignorance and insist she was merely performing her job, that she had not realized the bag was anything other than discarded trash left behind by a careless customer. On November 9th, 1978, the plan was executed. The older man arrived first, as always, and took his seat in a booth near the windows where he could observe the entrance. 20 minutes later, the younger man entered, and Patricia immediately positioned herself near the trash bin with a rag and a spray bottle of cleaner, making a show of wiping down the area and straightening the napkin dispensers on a nearby counter. When the younger man finished his meal and walked towards the exit, bag in hand, Patricia moved slowly, deliberately, gaining time and ensuring her movements appeared natural. The younger man placed the bag on top of the trash bin and walked out. Patricia waited precisely 3 seconds, sufficient for the man to clear the doorway and step into the parking lot, then grabbed the bag, pushed it down into the trash receptacle, pulled the full garbage bag out of the bin, tied it off, and began walking toward the back of the restaurant. A voice came from behind her, calm but insistent. Patricia turned and saw the older man standing there, his expression neutral, but his eyes fixed intently on the garbage bag she was carrying. He informed her that he believed she had just thrown away his food, that he had left it on top of the bin and had been returning to retrieve it. Patricia maintained a light and apologetic tone, explaining that she had not realized the bag belonged to anyone, that it was already in the trash now and mixed with everything else, and that she could offer him a refund or allow him to reorder if he wished. The older man's jaw tightened slightly, and he inquired if she could simply open the bag so he could check. Patricia reiterated that once something entered the trash, health code regulations prohibited her from retrieving it, as it was already contaminated by contact with other refuse, but that she would be happy to provide a refund or arrange for a replacement meal. There was a pause, a moment where the older man seemed to be weighing his options, calculating whether pressing the issue further would attract more unwanted attention. And then he shook his head and stated it wasn't necessary. He turned and exited the restaurant, his pace slightly quicker than when he had first stood up. Patricia watched him leave before continuing towards the back of the building. In the storage area, away from the dining room and the counter, Patricia and Lisa locked the door behind them and opened the garbage bag. They retrieved napkins, plastic cups, greasy wrappers, and finally the brown bag. Patricia meticulously opened it, her hands quivering slightly, and reached inside. What she extracted were 2 small photographs, each no wider than a few inches, produced on what appeared to be standard photographic paper. The images depicted what seemed to be pages from typed documents, columns of data, technical diagrams, stamps, and markings in the corners implying official classification. The format was instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with government paperwork or military documentation. These were not personal snapshots. These were photographs of restricted materials. Information of a kind that should not exist outside a secure facility, much less be concealed within a fast food bag and exchanged between 2 men in a public eatery. The decision was instantaneous. This required reporting to the FBI, and it needed to be done with utmost urgency. Patricia and Lisa returned the photographs to the bag, then sealed it within a larger plastic bag to preserve any potential evidence, and Patricia contacted the FBI field office in Alexandria later that afternoon, once her shift concluded and she was away from the restaurant. The agent who received the call initially expressed skepticism. Narratives of espionage discovered by fast food employees were not typically the kind of leads that escalated into significant investigations. However, when Patricia detailed the photographs and offered to bring them to the field office, the conversation's tone altered. An appointment was scheduled for the subsequent morning, and Patricia and Lisa were instructed to refrain from discussing their discovery with anyone else, not even with other restaurant staff. On November 10th, Patricia and Lisa arrived at the FBI field office and met with two agents who took their statements, examined the photographs, and posed detailed questions about the two men, the timing of the exchanges, and any other details Patricia or Lisa could recall. The photographs were logged as evidence and dispatched to FBI laboratory analysts and counterintelligence specialists at headquarters in Washington. Confirmation arrived the following week. The documents in the photographs were authentic and appeared to originate from within the Department of Defense, specifically from materials concerning satellite reconnaissance systems and technical specifications classified at levels demanding significant security clearance for access. What Patricia had stumbled upon was not a minor theft or a misunderstanding. It was active espionage. By November 15, 1978, a task force had been assembled to manage the case, headed by Special Agent Richard Kellerman, a seasoned counterintelligence officer with over 15 years of experience tracking Soviet intelligence activities on American soil. Kellerman had handled cases in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, and he had witnessed enough dead drops, brush passes, and signal sites to discern the hallmarks of professional tradecraft when he reviewed the specifics of what had transpired at the McDonald's. The assessment was straightforward. What Patricia had observed was a classic dead drop, a method of transferring information between an intelligence asset and a handler without necessitating face-to-face contact or any direct communication that could be intercepted or observed. The operational advantage of this technique lay in its simplicity and deniability. If executed flawlessly, it left no traceable connection between the two involved parties.